Hello, and welcome to Stowe Talks, a series of videos designed to support people going through a relationship breakdown and all of the challenges this brings. I'm Matthew Taylor.
And I'm Liza, family lawyers at Stowe Family Law. And in each episode, we bring in some of the amazing professionals we work with so they can share their advice and expertise on a range of issues, from co-parenting to financial advice to dealing with challenging ex-partners.
Today, we're joined by Lottie Kent, founder and owner of True Financial Design, as we look at the importance of understanding your financial situation and making plans that meet your immediate and long-term needs following a divorce or separation. A former director of financial planning in London, Lottie offers a range of financial planning options to help people control their financial future. She's an award-winning chartered financial planner and resolution-accredited divorce specialist, and supports people going through a divorce to create a simple plan to help them achieve financial security for the rest of their lives.
As the daughter of divorced parents, Lottie has first-hand experience of the emotional and financial challenges divorce creates during and afterwards. As a result, she is on a mission to help people through this difficult time and avoid them making financial mistakes they may live to regret. Welcome, Lottie, and thank you for joining us today.
Hello.
So if we can start with, why would somebody that's going through a divorce require or need the assistance of a financial planner?
There are numerous reasons, and a lot of clients come to us for lots of different reasons. But one of the main ones is really understanding what they need from the settlement in order to be okay for the rest of their lives, and understanding what potential settlements will look like for their future. But also really understanding what is in either their pot or in the joint pot, because there's a lot, finances are extremely complex, as we all know, but especially when it comes to pensions and things like that, people don't necessarily fully understand them, and especially when you're going through a divorce, it is super, super important to fully understand them, so people are then able to make the correct decisions for their future, basically.
So in terms of that understanding, is there a real education piece to do with people when they come to see you and kind of starting, what's people's background knowledge? At what levels are they at when they come to speak to you?
It's a real range. Generally, people that are coming to see myself are people that don't have a particularly wide knowledge of finances. Mm-hmm. They've never really dealt with the finances themselves before. Perhaps their partner or their ex-partner has dealt with them the majority of the time, and they really just want to get a full understanding of what is actually in the pot and what they need from that pot in order to be okay for the rest of their lives. And that is very, very hard to establish if you, from kind of when I say what you need from an income perspective, from a capital perspective in order to rehouse or buy the other half out of the family home potentially, and also income in retirement as well. A lot of people think very short term when going through divorce about the here and the now, but it's really, really important that people think right into the future, because otherwise often people would be left kind of very short further down the line.
So when somebody comes to you, where do you start?
Good question. So we start at the beginning, and we first of all establish exactly what they need from the settlement. So first of all, looking at what they need from an income perspective. So, and the first thing that I always suggest clients do is have a look, if they're unsure about what their current living costs are, have a look at the last 3 to 6 months bank statements and see what's going in, what's going out, and see exactly what their kind of essential expenditure is. So to keep a roof over the head, the food bills, the house bills, etc., etc. And then also the desirable costs, so things like, socialising and holidays and things like that, within reason, of course. And then looking for, if from a capital point of view, seeing what they need in order to either buy their other half out or to rehouse, and then also looking further on down the line, looking at and the other thing is children's costs in their day-to-day kind of cost of living. Some people have school fees that need to be taken into consideration. Some people want to pay for university costs for their children, things like that, and also looking further down the line to retirement. Of course, once children have left home, costs are going to reduce. But we hold clients' hands to make sure that their schedule of outgoings is kind of realistic for their needs and what they kind of want for the future. as well. And then from there, it's a case of looking at potential settlement scenarios and modelling that over that lead and seeing where the shortfalls are, and then speaking with the other relevant experts who are helping the clients, for example their solicitor, to see what other potential settlement could be kind of realistic for that client, and seeing whether, and modelling that over and over their needs to see what would be better for kind of them and their future, really.
When you're looking at someone's needs and they bring up a schedule of expenditure, a wish list, and they think, oh, I need this much for a house and need this. and then the lawyer says to you, that's great, but there's not that much money in the pot and we're not going to do that. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so managing expectations is absolutely key. And I think we all know that when there is less money in the pot, those cases are the hardest ones. Absolutely. Really, and the hardest ones to help clients with. And part of my role is very much managing clients' expectations and being realistic. You know, it is very rare, actually, to be honest with you, that my clients will come to me and say, I want to be going on X amount of holidays a year, and I need to buy my however many £1 million house. They are generally quite realistic. Sometimes we encourage them a little bit when there is quite a lot of money in the pot, and saying, and often clients don't necessarily know what they've been spending, so we will help them look through their bank statements and kind of see what it does cost to maintain their standard of living.
Do you have conversations surrounding the family home sometimes as to the benefits of retaining it versus selling it and splitting the proceeds?
Yes, that is a big one that comes up. As I often say to clients, and this goes hand in hand with kind of pensions and whether people decline, a share of the pension in order to keep the family home, for example, offsetting. But yes, that is one that comes up a lot. And often I say to clients, for that short-term upheaval, you can often obtain from the settlement long-term stability, as you will see yourselves. And we do all of that and illustrate that to the client through the Visualise Your Future process we go through with clients. And clients often then will make their own minds up. Nobody's telling them, but they can actually see what the impact of the decision or potential decision they would make would look like. And then they're thinking, actually, well, maybe I don't want to stay in the family home because A, it's going to cost me a lot of money to stay in it and run it. But also then I'm potentially saying goodbye to some very nice pension further down the line as well.
I think the emotional journey for clients with the family home is a really key thing. There are so many clients that we see who will come to us and be desperate to keep the family home because it's a bit of security in rough seas. And they maybe get further through the process and think, actually, maybe I want a fresh start. So I would imagine that dealing with the emotional process of divorce kind of makes your job very different than a lot of other financial planners. So how do you manage that side of things?
Yeah, that's another good question. And I think it's from an emotional point of view, you are definitely holding clients' hands much more than general kind of financial planning, if that makes sense. And again, it comes to, managing expectations and being there when you are delivering maybe not the most pleasant news and saying, well, it's not realistic that you do stay in the family home. Just holding their hand and saying, well, yes, that is the situation, but there are other positives that are coming out of this. And just reassuring them really and really being there for them and holding their hand through that process.
I mean, we haven't talked about pensions much, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, but what is your view of somebody that comes in and says, I just want to keep the house, and if that means I haven't, I won't have a claim on the pension, then that's fine. My priority is the house.
Yeah, I hear that. That's probably one of the most common things I hear people say, that, and I just don't know where to start. And I think my point of view on that is, yes, that's fine, and that is what a lot of people say to me. But as I always say to clients, let's look at it. Let's see what that means to you and what that means to your future. And actually, because we actually illustrate exactly what situations or what certain situations look like to clients, nobody's telling them. Nobody's saying you shouldn't do this, you should do that. They're actually educating themselves and thinking, well, actually, I don't want to do that, do I? Because actually, it's going to be really detrimental to my future. And by actually then having that kind of short-term upheaval of moving house and maybe downsizing at that time, then it just means that they have much more stability kind of further down the line. But again, it's really just being there for them and kind of managing their expectations. But that thing is, I hear that so much. I want to stay in the family home, and I must, basically. So very used to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really incredibly common.
Yeah.
And then it goes, you've mentioned about long-term income needs and kind of meeting those income needs in the short, medium and long term.
Yeah.
How do you actually physically do that when you're looking at someone who might have a bit of capital to draw on, they might be working, they might have pensions coming in? How do you, because it's complicated, there's so many things going on. How do you show that to clients?
So we use our process called Visualize Your Future. And basically, as it says on the tin, it creates a visual picture of somebody's future. So we will then show clients exactly what their needs are. So what they need in order to maintain their standard of living. So their essential expenditure, also the desirable expenditure. We're also able to put into the modelling that we use any capital expenditure that they may need. We can put in downsizing further down the line. And it's a very sophisticated bit of kit, basically, and you can vary it at certain times. So we might say, right, well, they want to retire at this age, but actually 5 years prior to that, their income might reduce a little bit. So everything is in there, and it just means that clients can actually see, I say in black and white what it looks like, but it's actually a beautiful, colourful picture.
Lovely.
They can actually see what the situation is, and they can see in red if there are any shortfalls, and then we have a discussion on, what can they do to address those shortfalls. It might be a case that actually once the children leave home, their income could increase. And that would then mean it's a very realistic conversation to have with the client. And they're thinking, well, actually, yeah, that's a good point. And it also brings that kind of, rather than making it about, for a client, as much as they want to get out from the divorce as much as they possibly can, they can see that as long as they're okay, that's the best way to look at it, and their needs are okay and their needs are met, then why go through that kind of extra turmoil of trying to fight for more, basically.
I think that's a really good point, is looking at what you actually get. I think as lawyers we probably get a bit hung up on the numbers sometimes, and this is a 50-50 case, so couldn't possibly accept 48%. Yeah. And then for someone like you to come and say, well, actually,
you'll be fine.
Yeah. That meets what the client has said their needs are. So why go to the extra hassle of...
Yeah, and of course, not every case is a needs case. Yeah. And I don't want to go into kind of complexities around that. But I think whatever situation you're looking at, even if it's a very large case, clients still have their wants and their wishes and their needs. Just because their needs might be very different to somebody else down the street, that's what their wants and kind of wishes are. And as long as they can be met, then that's that kind of ticks all the boxes for them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you said there, Matt, because I think a lot of clients do come in and they've heard about 50-50 or 60-40, and they're very much like, that's what I want, because that's the percentage that I've heard about, without understanding actually how that works and how that's going to move through for them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of clients, I just got to get exactly as much as I possibly can. I take him to the cleaners or whatever, that old chestnut. Yeah. And I just think actually, you can make it much more amicable, and your experience of divorce so much more pleasant if actually we're just focusing on you, focusing on what you need, and making sure that you're going to be okay for the rest of your life, rather than kind of trying to scrape at every kind of...
I think that's the important thing, is getting the client to focus on them and their future rather than what they are going to have, rather than what their ex is going to have. Yes. That must be a big part of it. Something that we're always
what they're losing.
Yeah, exactly.
They often think about, rather than what they're gaining, it's, well, I'm losing that.
Yes, yeah. Focus on the positives rather than the negatives. It's so much, it's a much nicer kind of way to do it, and that kind of approach. And don't get me wrong, often, and especially for kind of lower kind of value cases, it's very difficult, and there have to be compromises. But even in larger cases as well, that there are always some compromises, because you might not be able to go on that X £1,000 holiday every year or 5 times a year. Once there has to be adjustment on both sides, and I think actually by saying to clients and modelling exactly what it would look like, and saying you're going to be absolutely fine if you end up with X, and this is what your life would look like, they're like, actually, well, yeah, okay, I understand that and I can see that, rather than kind of not knowing, because nobody knows what, spreadsheets can go so far, but figures are complex things, and trying to project into the future on a spreadsheet from pension statements or investment statements, it means absolutely nothing to anybody. So kind of that visual picture for clients is really helpful for them.
Definitely. And then when you're looking at retirement, we've spoken about pensions a bit, and pensions are
fun stuff.
The fun stuff. This is a real juicy stuff. This is what I live for. But pensions are things that I think scare people a bit.
Yeah, 100%.
They don't understand them, or don't have to think about them because they're so far in the future. So how do you go through the kind of education process on pensions and make people think about them in more real terms?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And clients often will actually, because people don't know about pensions, they actually think, I don't want to think about them, which is probably one of the biggest mistakes that people can make. Not understanding the pensions and not understanding the type of pensions that people have is one of the biggest mistakes that people can make. So the where we start with pensions is, I would always say to clients, let's look at what pensions are in the joint pot and fully understand the type of pensions that they are. So there are, as you will both know, there are two different types of pensions. One are defined benefit pensions, which provide a guaranteed level of income to that member or that individual in retirement. Now that's a big benefit. Then there's defined contribution pensions, and as they say on the tin, they very much are determined by investment growth, fund value, and the current value when you get to retirement will then determine how much income that person will get. So there's not that same level of guarantee. Yep. Now, sometimes there are guarantees included in them, but it's not the same as this defined benefit. And often people won't understand the difference and then say, we'll split that 50-50 based on capital value. Now, a lot of defined benefit pensions are undervalued because they might be public sector schemes, for example, so they're unfunded schemes. And the problem with that then is, if you're splitting it 50-50 on capital, the capital value isn't the benefit, it's the income in retirement that is the benefit. And it's just that educational process to make sure people really understand the types of pensions that they've got and any complexities that there are when splitting them. And the other thing is making sure that people obtain an actuary report if they should get an actuary report. And an actuary report is generally, I would say, and I'm sure you are hoping you'll both agree, is when you will be kind of when there's the more complex pensions and there's a big age gap, and you've got the defined benefit pensions and you want to know how to equalise those based on income when, for when clients get to retirement age. And I think the main thing is fully understanding those pension pots. Because if you don't, how do you know the consequences or how to split them, basically?
Yeah, and I think, we're not pension experts. Like us, we're not. But we're not pension experts, but judges aren't either. Yeah. So it's having that advice to them, because otherwise, if you're going through court proceedings, it's very difficult for them to make a decision if they haven't got the correct information. Yeah. What's the difference between coming to a financial planner and going to an actuary, and how do you work together with those reports and that information? Yeah, so actuaries are very much focused on the calculations of how to split the more complex pensions, like the defined benefit pensions. So they run numerous calculations to be able to establish how to equalise income in retirement, or generally equalise income in retirement based on the pensions that are in the pot. For the less complex pensions, like the defined contribution pensions, like, for example, personal pensions, money purchase schemes, things like that, generally, if there's not a very large age gap, then you could say, right, well, here's the capital value of the pot. If we were to split it 50-50, this is what, you would each end up with pretty much, if you were invested in the same investment, the same contracts, with the same providers, and you got to retirement, you both had the same current value when you got to retirement, and it would produce
the same amount of income if you both did exactly the same thing. So that's almost like a kind of a fair way to do it, and a financial planner can help on that side. But it's the more an actuary will, we as financial planners have a very fine line where we would go up to, and then where we would say, right, you need to get an actuary involved, because doing those complex calculations of how to equalise say, for example, an NHS pension or, a fire brigade pension or a civil service pension or whatever the case may be on retirement, we're not qualified as financial planners to do that. But that said, going through the actuary report is a client will then be faced with a 50-page document. They have no idea how to read it, and because they're extremely complicated. So we will help a client understand and make sense of that, and then model that for them so they can see the different options that are within the actuary report and fully understand it, and know what the different scenarios and different options will mean to them in their future as well.
You said about age gap. What difference does that make, whether there's just 1 or 2 years or 10 years between the parties?
So age gap is key. Couple of reasons that age gap is key is, one, if there is a younger spouse, they've got longer to accrue more pension for their retirement or save towards their retirement. But the other thing is they are also likely to, they will live longer generally, and generally women live longer than men as well. So it's if the client is younger, then they're going to need income for longer, essentially. So it just adds that extra layer of complexity.
And talking about, I guess, women living longer and the different sort of gender factors, one thing that keeps coming up in studies and reports about pensions on divorce and pensions in general is the gender gap in pensions. So women tend to have less pension provision in retirement than men do, partly as a result of financial settlements and divorce, partly because of income and career progression during the working life. How do you see that play out with your clients? Is it something where men tend to want to hold on to their pension, or am I overly generalising? It's something that women will kind of say, no, the family home.
I think there's two very difficult subjects to share, or assets to share on divorce, and one is inheritance, because it's very personal, and the other is pension, or our pensions, should I say. So yes, generally it's the male party that will have the larger pensions, because traditionally in traditional relationships, and I don't want to stereotype, but in traditional relationships, perhaps the female has given up work to have the children, potentially not gone back to work, and the male party has been the main breadwinner. And of course, no person wants to give up their pension, but at the end of the day, that the female has often given up her career and to maintain the family home and look after the children as well. So it's a case of, there is that element of the sharing is kind of there's a need for that sharing, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does all come back to need, but I think you probably see this as well. Sometimes with typically the man, the person who's got the pension, it's sometimes hard to convince people that's a marital asset.
It can be, very difficult, particularly actually depending on the type of pension. So I used to do a lot of work with armed forces, and they can be very, very protective over their pensions. Yeah,
and the same for inheritance as well. People think, well, it's my parents that have given me that inheritance. Why should it be a marital asset? And it's a very difficult one, but it's again, the law is the law at the end of the day. And when you're entering into that marriage commitment and that agreement, then that's something that you're agreeing to, essentially.
And how do you deal with cases where a client may come to you and say, look, I just don't know what's in the pot. I don't have a clue. My spouse runs a business. Okay, what's the business worth? I don't know. I don't run the business. Yeah. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So a phrase I very, very often use is, you don't know what you don't know. But the best thing that client has done is by seeking help and advice. And often clients get very upset and feel stupid that I get so many apologies. Yeah, clients very often say to me, I'm so sorry, I just don't know, I just don't understand. And it's that level of reassurance to the client and just saying, don't worry, we will do it together, we'll work together as a team to get there. And it's really just asking clients the right questions so they can then go away and obtain that information. But we make, as much as it's a very complex situation and process, we make it very manageable and easy for the client, because I suppose once you know the right questions to ask and be able to obtain that information, and then clients can just find it, and then you can do all the other kind of necessary work behind the scenes, then it makes it easier for the client and more straightforward.
And in terms of finding out that information, obviously through, if there's a legal process involved, we'll generally do a process of disclosure, whether it's through court, mediation, some form of ADR, use the Form E, use voluntary disclosure. Do you get involved at that stage with clients, or do you tend to wait until, presumably you're not waiting until after a settlement, you want to come in early? What's your ideal kind of when to get involved with a client? When should they be picking up the phone saying, Lottie, help?
So I always say to clients, the earlier you get somebody like myself involved, the better. Regardless of which route a client is going down, whether they are sorting it out between themselves, whether they've got solicitors and they're going down the negotiation route, whether they're going through mediation, whichever route they are going down, the earlier on in the process they get somebody like us involved, the easier it'll be for them, for the solicitor, for the mediator, because the thing is we are providing them with the financial knowledge and financial expertise, so when they go to their solicitor, they know what they're asking for and they know what they've got. When they go into mediation, they know what they're asking for and why they're asking for it, because they've got evidence of what they need, rather than just plucking figures out of thin air and not really knowing what they're asking for. And so it's really a case of just helping them through kind of that process and obtaining exactly what they need and finding out that the right information, really.
And if they don't come to you at that early stage, if they leave it and they're maybe halfway through the proceedings or even after a financial order has been made, what are the most common mistakes that you come across that people, because they've left it so late?
So even if they are kind of a day before an FDR or 2 days before an FDR, we work very, very hard to basically help them. But it is very much a case of still starting at the beginning and still starting with that need and modelling that need against that kind of potential settlement scenario, the potential settlement scenario against that need, to see exactly, is it going to fit that need? What are the shortfalls? What variations should or could be made to make it better? And I suppose mistakes is a good question. I suppose one of the biggest mistakes is people not understanding what the settlement, what their potential settlement looks like before committing to it. Because how do you know that you're going to be okay for the rest of your life if you don't know what the settlement looks like or what it means to you, your children, or your future? That's one of the biggest things. And also not asking for help is another one as well, not getting the right experts involved, because the thing is people say, I don't want to get an actuary involved and, spend maybe £2,000-3,000 on an actuary report. But actually that £2,000-3,000 could mean a huge amount to your future. And, that £3,000 is very, very little when you look at the income that you could get for the rest of your life in retirement. And I think by having the right experts involved, they can kind of hold your hand through that process and make sure that you do have all the tools that you need to be able to get the settlement you want. Post-settlement, the biggest mistake people make is not making a plan once they receive that settlement pot. Because however large that pot is, it won't last forever. And if you haven't got a plan and to know exactly what you're able to be spending each year for that money to last, and if you're not investing that money, cash at the moment, inflation rates are so high, cash is actually, decreasing in value. So if people aren't investing that money or looking at the pot correctly and actually making sure it's structured in the best way to meet their objectives for the rest of their life, then it's not going to fit that need for the rest of their life or be able to fulfill their needs and their wishes for the rest of their life.
And do you carry on working with clients after the settlement? So you've done your decree absolute, you've got your pot of money, your pension sharing orders come, so you've got your own pension.
Yeah.
You carry on that relationship?
100%. So we work with a client all the way through the process. So first of all, we were starting at the beginning, establish their need from an income, a capital, and an income in retirement point of view, then model the potential settlement scenarios whilst they're going through the negotiation process. We will tweak those potential settlements in the modelling so they can see exactly what they look like. And then once they get to settlement stage, it's a case of, and then all the court kind of process has been completed, settlement is finalised and completed, then we will structure that pot in the best way for a client to meet their needs for the rest of their life. So what's quite nice in our role is we actually see clients go from this kind of shadow and this shell often, then this scared person into this, and they blossom and just become really, really confident and about their finances and their future. And that to me is what is so rewarding about what I do, because you see clients that are just so scared about the future, and they're like, boom, I'm going to be okay now, you know? And I know what I'm doing for the rest of my life. So, that to me is, and holding their hand and just being able to carry on and working with them is amazing. And what's really nice is then when solicitors say, oh, well, you know, that client, how's Dar doing? And it's like, oh, she's doing great, or he's doing great. And it's just really,
it's
really
so nice to hear when we get to hear that, because we've gone through like the horrible time. Yeah. And then like you carry on the relationship with some clients and some understandably never want to hear from you again. Like I get that. Like you don't want to have emails from Matt ever again. No. So to hear that, you're just like, oh, that's brilliant. Oh, well done then. It's really, really nice.
It's nice. And just to be able to, say to solicitors, you know, they've got a plan. They know what they're doing. Yeah, they're set for life. Yeah.
So Lottie, when you're giving financial advice and it's part of the divorce process, I'm assuming you get a lot of legal questions as well, in the same 100%. Way that we get a lot of financial questions. So what sort of common legal issues come up, and how do you deal with those when you're trying to focus on the financial advice? Yeah,
I think one thing that I often experience is clients come to a divorce expert, i.e. a solicitor or a divorce expert who's a financial planner or a mediator or whoever, and they think that divorce expert will deal with every single aspect of divorce. So clients will often come to me and say, what is fair? Or what will I get, you know, what settlement will I get? That is not my area of expertise. And there is a very, very fine line between where I can go up to and help clients, and then when I would have to say, right, well, you need legal advice for this. So I can model potential settlement scenarios until the cows come home for clients. They could say, well, you know, if I was to get 75% of this and 100% of his pension and all this kind of stuff. But let's be realistic. That's not realistic. And so clients need to, if they're sorting it out amicably between themselves, then that's fine, and we can model these situations. But I do very, very clearly say to clients that I can model situations all day long, but if this was ever to go further down the line and go to court or whatever the case may be, there is no guarantee that this would be what would be agreed. And so a lot of questions that I get asked from a legal side of things is kind of what is fair. That's a big one.
That's the $1 million question, isn't it?
If only we knew.
Exactly. And what settlement will I end up with? And you both know that it's so specific to individual circumstances and client cases that and all the situations that are kind of involved in it, that it's just really important that they seek that expert legal advice if there is the need to do so.
It is really difficult because I think clients come in for initial appointment and they want a black and white answer. They want to know, can I keep the house? What pension share will I get? What am I, what assets are going to go into the pot, etc. And we've got a discretionary system. So it is down to fairness, and I'm sure in the room, we all have a different concept of what fairness is. The judge might have a different concept. Both parties always have a different concept of what fairness is. So there is quite a broad settlement range, and anything within that range can be deemed fair. But that can be really, really tough sometimes for clients to hear, because they just want a really straightforward answer.
I think clients really, really struggle with this kind of element of starting at 50 and then the sliding scale one way or the other, and trying to, the amount of times clients come to me and say, oh, well, my solicitor says it starts at 50 and then it slides one way or the other. And they really, really struggle with that, and not having, as you say, this black and white, answer is really hard. And it's really kind of holding their hand and working that way, working with them through the process, so they then come back to this rather than what is fair and can I get the most out of this pot, is, just make sure you're focusing on you and what you need. And then as long as that's covered, if there's some extra, great, so.
When you're talking about the pot,
yes.
that can be quite, sometimes a bit of a difficult legal concept for clients to grasp, because sometimes are pensions included, are pre-acquired assets included, is inheritance included? Presumably you get a lot of queries about that, and then you're kind of like, no, speak to your lawyer, to your lawyer.
100%. And exactly, because the thing is as financial experts, we're not solicitors. And as much as we as specialists in the divorce area have a lot of knowledge about kind of the legal side of it, we're not experts, and we'd be very, very wrong to give legal advice. Just like for solicitors, it's very wrong to give financial advice. And so that's why with this team approach and working together as a team, it actually gets the best outcome for the client further down the line. And it just means that if a client has got all the relevant experts involved, then it just means that I think it often saves clients quite a lot of money in the long run, because they know they go to the right expert at the right time, and because they've got experts that are working in their expert field, then they're going to get the best outcome for themselves further down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's often that thought of, I'm paying more people, and you're already paying legal fees, you're already paying, your cost of the court fees, you're already paying, it's an expensive business separating anyway, because you've suddenly got two houses often and extra bills and things. So sometimes the idea of them paying another person can be like, oh, really? But it comes back in spades, doesn't it? It's taking that long-term view.
Yes, 100%. And I think it's that long-term view is key. And I think very much an educational part from our side of things, but often, on the legal side of things as well, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but clients seem to, solicitors tend to say to me, you say go to get financial advice to a client, and often they're quite resistant to it because they don't want to get that other kind of part involved there. And sometimes I think it's that they don't want that extra level of complexity, really. They don't want somebody else to deal with, but actually by being slightly uncomfortable with it in the first instance will make it a much more comfortable situation, both kind of in the near future, but also in the long-term future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Matt, then I'm just going to draw back. So Lottie was just talking there about inheritances and pre-acquired assets to the marriage. So, what advice would you give?
When we're talking about inheritances, my starting point will always be to determine the facts of when the inheritance has been received and the status of the asset. So in financial remedy proceedings, you're looking at the pot, you're looking at the matrimonial assets. What assets have come from the marriage? Inheritance is a classic non-matrimonial asset because it's come from another source. It's not a product of the marriage. So the starting point is that'll be non-matrimonial. And the difference is you have the matrimonial part, which can be available for sharing. There can be an automatic right to 50-50. And the inheritance can sit outside that. And if it's non-matrimonial, that means it can't be shared, so there's not an automatic right to 50-50, but it can be used to meet needs. So that's the starting point. The difficulty with inheritance, and this is where it probably gets incredibly difficult for a lot of your clients, is it can become matrimonial.
Mingles.
Get it mingled. And that's the word. That's the word. We love a bit of mingling, which feels like, drinks party, but it's a lot less pleasant.
Yeah.
And commonly is the money's been paid in, it's an inheritance, and maybe it's gone into the family home. And as soon as money goes in the family home, that is the sacrosanct thing in family law. We've already talked about how important the family home is. Yeah. If it's mingled in, it becomes matrimonial and it's available for sharing. And that's incredibly difficult, isn't it, for a lot of clients to deal with.
Absolutely.
And just, can I ask a question with regards to pensions then and pension contributions during the marriage? And then, sometimes it's sharing. The whole pension pot is matrimonial, becomes part of the matrimonial pot. But sometimes clients say, well, I only want to look at the contributions that have been made during the marriage. Yeah. how is that viewed?
There's a question.
Sorry.
This is a real hot button topic question, I think. And it's the starting point is the same, isn't it?
Yeah.
If it's pre-acquired, the starting point is it's non-matrimonial. It's not a product of the marriage. So great, it sits outside. Oh, I can keep my pension that I've accrued before the marriage. But then you've got to remember it's got that cross-check on needs, and needs is what's so important.
Yeah.
Parties' needs have to be met. And generally with pensions, even when you have high-value pensions, you're not necessarily having that much income in retirement from them. If you've been married for 10, 15 years and there's a premarital pension, there's a standard of living during the marriage. And for a party to come out and say, I need 25,000, 30,000 a year in retirement, well, that can only be met by taking a share of the premarital pension. So commonly, unless you're dealing with a sharing case where there's surplus assets and they're just not needed, and they're a small percentage of cases.
Yeah, or a very short marriage.
Or a very short marriage, exactly. Then commonly they'll be brought in, won't they? And that's the hardest thing, I think.
I think it's really difficult for clients to accept that, particularly, in some cases they've been paying into that pension for 10, 15 years before the marriage. And that can be a really, really bitter pill.
And there's something psychological about a pension because you only ever see it on your payslip. It's not something that people get, that if you get money from your income and you put it in an ISA, okay, well, I've made a conscious decision to do that.
Yeah.
It's money that otherwise would have gone on the holiday, but we saved it. And saying, well, that just was paid into a fund and that's mine. That's on my payslip. It's never been contributed to by my spouse. But, it is, you summed it up really well earlier. It's about the partnership. It's about maybe the wife's taking time off work and not being able to develop that pension. Maybe it's been the decision to kind of pay more into a pension, otherwise would have come into the marriage. But fundamentally, a lot of couples rely on one pension in retirement, don't they?
Yeah.
You've got a good pension because you have a DB scheme, defined benefit scheme. I don't really have one, so we'll use your pension in retirement, and that's why it gets split, isn't it?
It is definitely one of the issues that we still, I don't know about you, argue the most about within divorce proceedings is whether premarital pensions, the whole pension should be taken into account, or whether this bit should be put to one side because it was acquired sort of pre-marriage. But again, it comes down to this fairness and how vague it is.
But I also think that often clients don't understand, because they literally just get, either they say it on their pay slip or they just get a statement each year. They don't fully understand the value until they start drilling down, and then they're like, oh, well, actually, this is worth a lot of money. And although it's kind of untangible because they can't access it until a certain age, they're thinking, but still, that's mine and I've accrued that. And I think, again, that's once they start drilling down on actually the value that's on, within that pot and they've accrued, then it's like, it's a tricky subject.
It really is, yeah. And the knowledge path is kind of, as you're talking about, people don't want to engage in pensions, then you have to tell them about them, then they suddenly get slightly obsessed with them because they realise they're worth a bit more than they thought, but actually they're going to pay out less and they're going to give away more, and they kind of go up, down all the way through the proceedings. It's it's a bit of a tricky thing, I think, to get the head around sometimes.
Yes, 100%.
And just as a final point, I think, before we finish, what happens when you are dealing with a non-disclosing spouse? So it's not just your client comes to you and doesn't really know what they've got, but their spouse is not going to tell them. How do you deal with that? It's one of the trickiest things we deal with. Is someone who is determined to not give bank statements or company interests or whatever it may be. How do you deal with that?
That's a good question, but it's very much we're then going back into this kind of legal and what's okay to obtain. If people have left statements out on the side, then of course somebody might glance over and see what's in that. But that's not going to be the case if
but
this
don't
person...
take them and don't copy them.
No,
definitely don't give them to your lawyer.
I don't want to see them.
Exactly.
That will give them a heart attack,
No, exactly. That's what I mean. So if they just glance over and say, well, I think they've got this and it's fine. But the likelihood is that spouse isn't going to have left that out if they're hiding assets from them. So it's a case of going down. I would always refer it onto a solicitor.
Basically, it's our problem, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, fine. That's absolutely fair. But it's a really tricky thing to do. And there's stuff that you can do through the legal process, and it can be complicated, it can be difficult. But that's...
And I don't know, how often do you have cases where there's a spouse that's genuinely... I find that it's raised a lot as a concern, because I think when you're going through a separation or divorce, there is immediately that lack of trust. And it's like, well, I don't know, and therefore they are probably trying to get rid of things and hide things. But in reality, actually, when we go through the disclosure process, it's quite rare, I find, that assets have genuinely been hidden or attempted to be hidden.
Yeah, and I think, but the other one is when clients, I have some clients that come to me and say, I have no idea, because when you're a couple, when you're married, there are obviously tax efficient ways to invest together rather than, and put things in maybe a non-earning spouse's name rather than the high earning spouse, and then they end up with lots of things in their name. They just have no idea that they even have these things in their names, and sometimes it can be debts in their names as well. So it's again looking at what is in people's names and making sure they know exactly what is theirs, what's in the joint pot. But I think you're right, it's rare that clients are thinking that somebody is really royally trying to hide assets. And the other thing is, I've actually got a case at the moment when there is suspicion that there might be something that's been hidden, but do they want to continue drilling down, and that there's more legal costs, there's more ag, and this client just wants it to end, and she's just said, I just as long as I'm okay, I want this over.
That's it. You need to do the cost benefit analysis. You need to be sure that it's a sufficient asset base that it's worth spending the money and spending the time and the heartache on chasing that.
And the emotion.
Emotional costs. It's not just a financial cost, it's the emotional cost of continuing with it.
And those costs, those cases where it's genuinely worth pursuing, they're really, very rare. But like you say, it gets raised a lot.
Yeah, it does.
Valuations are a bit of I think that's one thing of, if people can be a little bit shady on valuations, especially businesses and things like that. But I think that's just making sure that relevant experts have come in to make sure things are valued correctly.
Absolutely. You need to make sure it's done independently and you're not just taking people's words for it.
100%.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Lottie, for joining us.
No problem at all.
Thank you.
You can find out more about all the work that Lottie does supporting people with their finances during a divorce or separation at truefinancialdesign.co.uk.
In the next and final episode of this series, we'll be joined by Dr. Supriya McKenna, where she will offer her expertise and advice for people who are separating from or divorcing a narcissist.
So that's it for this episode of Stowe Talks. Thanks for joining. We hope you found it helpful and informative.
If you would like more information on future videos, our podcast series and programme of webinars, head over to stowetalks.co.uk, where you can sign up for our email list, as well as checking out our previous episodes and forthcoming events.
And please do rate, like, share and review this episode where you can.
Thank you, and see you next time.